All right. Kids, are you ready for Sunday school? The adults are. Kids, are you guys ready? Yeah? Woo-woo. All right, see ya. Have fun. Okay, follow your teacher, follow your line leader. If you're here for the Seder lesson, it's right next door over there. If you're here for Start Here, follow the tall pastor. And if you're here for Adult Ed, you're in the right place. All right. So as we kind of get our bagels and coffee and get settled, I want to give a quick ask. At the end of this class, I need a couple of volunteers to help reshuffle this room because tonight we have our church family potluck. And so we're going to be bringing some tables in from the Potter room and setting them up for food service and for people to sit. And so if a couple people, I saw Pete, a couple people could just stick around for a few minutes right after the class, that'd be super helpful. The potluck is at 6 p.m. Any other questions? Will, I'm going to volunteer you as well to help reset the room. Welcome. All right, let's pray as we get started. God, thanks so much for this time. Thank you for this sunshine streaming into this room, for the reminders of new life, the reminder that you are always doing a new thing, that you have new things to teach us, ways that you want to invite us to grow and learn and become more like you. And so I pray this morning that as we learn from Heath and as we reflect on your truths, God, that you would continue to shape us ever more into your image. It's in your name, Jesus Christ, that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good morning. How are you doing? Good to see you all again. We're crossing the halfway point of a 4-week series on Who is My Neighbor? Cultivating love and justice in dangerous times. If you remember back a couple weeks ago now, we started with kind of laying out the overall kind of where are we at right now in a challenging moment in this society when it comes to being neighbors, imagining the folks that live around us as neighbors in the spirit of the Gospels. And that day we also talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan and the surprising ways in which that parable is in some ways couldn't be more timely in a time when we're really narrowing our sense of who our neighbors are, that parable calls us to think more expansively, to imagine more expansively. Last week we did a deeper dive into the question of how it is that we've come to this moment where it feels like sometimes that Jesus' commandment might actually be to love our like-minded neighbors as ourselves. And we talked about the changing political party structure in our society, as well as the media ecosystem and the way it's evolved over the last generation, and the ways in which that kind of leads us at a structural level to a place where it's really tough, actually, to figure out what it even looks like to interact with folks who disagree with us, let alone to love them. Along the way, I've tried to say on a few occasions that it might sound like the answer is just more niceness. We just need to be nicer. And I've said, I don't think that's actually the answer. And last week, there was some good conversation both during the session and after about, what do we do with the fact that, part of where that reluctance to embrace neighbors who think differently about us than we do comes from the fact that we have this sense of like there are really important disagreements. The disagreements that we have with one another really matter. There may be life even may be at stake in the kinds of disagreements that we have. And so there can feel something not quite right about embracing someone who we think has a view that we might really find reprehensible or dangerous or disturbing in some important ways. So I want to think with you, I kind of promised last week that we would return to this issue and again, the kind of, what does it look like to cultivate both love and justice together, which I think is what our faith calls us to do. Can we do both? So hide it under a bushel? No. Many of you will know the song, This Little Light of Mine. This little light of mine. I'm not going to sing it. I did a little sing last week. It's, but famously, you get to that point in the song where it says, hide it under a bushel. No, right? This is the children's song. It's the song I grew up with. Growing up, we had all different added verses, shine all over Topeka. That was where I lived when I was learning this song. I love the song. I still love the song. And as a child, I think in the churches I grew up in, the song was kind of a call to share my individual faith in Jesus with my neighbors. That was what the meaning of the song really was. Much, much later, when I was in graduate school, I think, I learned that the song had this really interesting history in the life of our country. It was actually a song that was sung in the Civil Rights Movement. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And in that context, it was sung, this is Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a remarkable black woman who was deeply engaged in fights for civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s, became an important figure on the national stage. And Fannie Lou Hamer led through song before she led in any other way. And so there's these remarkable recordings of that song being sung by civil rights activists, singing it together. And when they sang it together, I think in many ways, maybe even more than the way that I sang it in Sunday school growing up, the song is sort of fully embodies the spirit of the text that it comes from in the Gospels, where Jesus is talking about, to his followers, how you're like a city on a hill. You are a light unto the world. And Jesus in that text is talking to them collectively. And in some sense, for Fannie Lou Hamer, for folks in the civil rights movement, when they sang that song, it was a collective call to public witness, living out their faith in public, loving their neighbors, which led them to stare down people. We've talked about it before, and I'll come back to it next week. Even in the face of violence, of police dogs and gas and all that kind of stuff, that they were not going to hide their light under a bushel. So I loved the song as a kid. I've loved the more I've learned about it, the role that it's played in important movements for justice in our nation's past. Probably because as Christians, I think it's important to stand up for the truth that we're not just fundamentally called to be nice. We're called to love our neighbors as ourselves, not just our like-minded neighbors, but all of our neighbors as ourselves. But we also are called to witness to the love and justice, righteousness of the God who made us. And at our best, we do this not only in our personal lives, but also together. So we've been thinking together about what does it mean for a congregation to cultivate love and justice in dangerous times, in times like these. Sometimes, and I think, per the conversations last week, when you talk about this stuff and talking about loving all of our neighbors, people can tense up because they think that you're going to ask them to lay aside the things that they believe, or to moderate them, to trade the real, full truth of their convictions for some kind of, let's just meet in the middle and pretend like we don't actually disagree, kind of pretend ground, a sort of pretend compromise that doesn't really exist. So today, I want to be very clear, that the message of this series for me is not that in order to live faithfully in times as divided as these, the thing to do is to lay aside or water down our convictions. I don't think that. I think it actually, when we do that, that can be a disaster. I don't know how many of you know the story of what happened after the Civil War in this country. Sometimes folks, when they tell the story of race in the United States, it can seem like it's just one constant line, and in fact, there's been many ups and downs in this story. The Civil War, terrible war that produced finally a Northern victory in 1865. And in the wake of the North's victory, the radical Republicans, as they were known at the time, Lincoln's party, led the passage of a number of really critical amendments that are still part of our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, established due process, and established voting rights for black men. In the wake of the war, and in that phase where these amendments are being passed in the South, part of what we know is there was a new thing being born in the South in the wake of the Civil War, and a multiracial democracy was being born. And in fact, in the wake of the war, in the decade after the war, black men were in the majority in the state legislature of South Carolina, this one-time hotbed of secessionism. There was a black governor in Louisiana. There was a black senator from the state of Mississippi. This was stuff that was completely unimaginable 10 years previously, and it would not long live. But in the season in which it was there, it's just true that there was almost like a completely new radical thing coming to be. Black people were forming independent churches. Everywhere that there were Republican Party leagues and union leagues and independent black churches, there was a flourishing kind of multiracial democracy emerging. We don't think about 1870 South Carolina as a hotbed of multiracial democracy, but it was. It's kind of an astounding thing. We don't think about it. That's like the thing where we kind of erase that moment. But it's hard. We shouldn't erase the moment, because it was a thing that was being born and that was killed, actually. It had to be killed, and it was by reactionary violence. First at the grassroots, and then eventually after 1876, there was a contested presidential election in 1876. And part of the deal that was made was that the Republican would get to take the White House, and in return, the North would withdraw federal troops from the South. And in the wake of the withdrawal of federal troops, which marks the end of the kind of official Reconstruction period after the war, you see the slow backslide from vibrant multiracial democracy to Jim Crow. And it took decades, actually. It wasn't instantaneous. It took decades. But why am I talking about this right now? Because we shouldn't lay aside our convictions. One of the things that happened in that period after the withdrawal of federal troops was white people in the North and in the South basically decided, they often talked about, there was much pageantry around it. Ida B. Wells, I should say, grew up, we talked about Wells. Wells is this remarkable civil rights activist, also deeply motivated by her faith, who, I have her up here because she was born in this period as the war was ending, and she came of age in the period when this multiracial democracy thing was taking off in the South. She, her family died of a yellow fever epidemic when she was a teenager, and she moved to Memphis. And in Memphis, she was involved in these kind of remarkable black literary networks. She became a journalist. She was a teacher. She was, in the early 1880s, riding the train back from her teaching job kind of outside of Memphis back into the city, and was accosted by the conductor, who told her that she had to move to the out of the ladies' car. She had bought a ticket for the ladies' car, which those were not nice days to ride a train. So you could pay a little bit more money if you were a woman and get a nicer seat in this more comfortable car. She had paid the price for the nicer ticket. The conductor came up to her and said, you can't be in this car. She kind of went back and forth with him, ended up in a confrontation with him, and rather, he was then eventually joined by other passengers who were trying to move her out, and she got off at the next stop rather than move to the back of the train. She went on to sue the train company for this offense, and she won in court because the law was on her side, and she won. When the train company appealed it, she won again, because again, the laws post-Reconstruction were on her side. And then it went all the way up to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and she lost. And she wrote in her diary how deeply disappointed she was. She said, because I believed that the law would be on my side. And she believed that because this thing had been born that was changing life in the South. That court case in the Tennessee Supreme Court would become a major precedent for Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which established separate but equal as the law of the land. But in the decades after, my slides. Northern and Southern white folks in the decades after the end of formal Reconstruction would get together and kind of really put on these almost like pageants of reconciliation. And the idea of burying the bloody shirt, they called it, which was this terrible war that had been fought in our country, that pitted, that hundreds of thousands of people died in. And so, the desire for reconciliation itself was good, but the terms of the reconciliation were the forgetting, the intentional neglect of the civil rights that had been secured in the wake of the war. And so the kind of knitting together of the country, this is the subject of David Blythe's excellent book, Race and Reunion. The terms on which reconciliation happened were the laying aside of the moral convictions that had come into the law in the wake of the war. This is, for me, a classic case, one of the paradigm cases in American history where laying aside or watering down our convictions because we want to be nice, because we want to patch things up with people with whom we have deep disagreements, it can be actually quite atrocious. And in fact, for 100 years, the way that the country was knitted back together on these terms meant that Jim Crow was the law of the land for 100 years in this country. So as we think about how to navigate our own deeply divided moment, I think the Reconstruction story is a cautionary tale, not to pretend as though our disagreements don't matter. I sometimes worry, we've talked about it already in the last couple of weeks, that we're living in a time where people have allowed, politics has become kind of a national religion in such a way that it drives our political identities or affiliations, drive not only how we vote, but where we shop, where we eat, and where we worship. Increasingly, churches are places that are aligned in partisan ways that more or less reflect the partisan divisions of the country. There are some congregations that have said we want to be purple in our composition, and in that sense, to resist the urge to align church with party. And I think there's given where we've been, I think there's things to really commend this approach, though there are also dangers with it, one of which can be that in these divided times, one way that folks can try to stay purple is to say we're not going to talk about, or we're going to lay aside these important questions of how we live life together in the world. So how do you kind of live faithfully into a gospel, a vision of the neighbor that's not partisan, but while also finding ways to keep important issues that actually do divide people in our country today on the table? Are there ways to hold together in the midst of deep difference in ways that also involve telling the truth? For me, I think we should be bold in proclamation, unafraid to speak the truth. But as the Apostle Paul reminds us, if we have not love, we're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And this is the thing we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. The thing I worry about these days is we have not love. We've allowed scorn and condescension to take pretty deep root in our congregations. And the more that we practice those ungenerous arts, the more I think we nurture the kinds of resentments and division that is really got our churches and our country in a tough spot right now. So part of what I want to think about with you today is, what does it look like? What might it look like to have love and also to stand in our convictions? And can we do both of those things? Right now, I mean, imagine a lot of you have seen this if you haven't seen it in your own immediate proximate circles, you've certainly seen it online or heard about it online, that a lot of what happens when we try to talk about what we really believe in our society these days is people start to immediately draw lines and immediately to engage in practices of shaming and shunning. I think somewhere along the way, many of us kind of got it into our heads that if we really want to stand up for what we believe in, then we have to draw lines in the sand and make clear that if you don't already agree with me, that you are not someone I'm going to be able to be associated with. And I've certainly seen this increasing in recent years. And again, I think we could talk about it and whether there are circumstances in which that's maybe justified. But often the line drawing itself isn't enough. In the age of social media, you move from drawing a line to a kind of shaming behavior that in the sort of social media landscape in particular often can produce really remarkable pile-ons, where there's a person or a movement that becomes the kind of cause du jour, and the thing to do to be doing part of the right thing is to be piling on to kind of shaming posts about that person, what they've done, who they are. Sometimes we then move from shaming to shunning, which is I won't have anything to do with you, I won't engage you in conversation, I won't be seen with you. And sometimes even beyond that, I will reprimand anyone that's in my circles if I notice that they are talking to you. So it kind of moves out from even just our own person to kind of policing others in our circles and how they interact with folks with whom we disagree. So to be clear, I think there are sometimes folks who are really toxic or who engage in such poor faith that you have to borrow the biblical analogy, to shake the dust off of one's sandals and move along. I think that can be a real thing that sometimes we really need to do. But I also think as a society that our sandal dusting gauge has become a little overactive. We so often fall prey to the temptation to write people off so quickly and so unceremoniously and frankly often so cruelly. And I do wonder for us as Christians whether we can do this in good faith. I think the stakes are high. And as folks who are called to love our neighbors as ourselves and to have more expansive visions of who our neighbors are, I sometimes wonder what it is in our faith that leads us to believe that we can boil another person down to the worst thing they've said or done or believed. At what point do we get to write someone off? Someone who presumably God made and God loves, just as God made and loves us. When did we, who are in need, I believe our faith teaches, of God's grace ourselves, come away with the idea that God is somehow done with us, but not with the other? In recent years, I've had conversations with folks around the country who have told me that people don't change. Students might change, one person told me, but adults don't change. Once people come to believe something, you just can't change their minds. I worry about this. I mean, I worry about it, partly I'm an educator, so it's core to my own sense of vocation that we can change our minds about things. We can learn. We can have our horizons expanded. But I think even if you're not an educator by trade, there's something really important to believe that people can change, that also that we ourselves can change. It seems to me to be pretty core to our faith, to our sense of what it can mean to be human. Because if someone can't change, then you really may not need to they may not be worth your time, right? If you find them to be deeply problematic as they are, and then you believe they'll never change, I wonder where that belief leads. Across our society, across the different lines that divide us that we've been talking about in recent weeks, there is a declining faith in the possibility of persuasion, the possibility that people can change, which I think is troubling for democracy, which rests on the idea that people can and should debate questions about how we live together in the world. Our entire system of government, in some sense, is born out of the idea that we should debate public questions together about how we're going to live our lives, how we're going to live together in a society. And at the end of that debate, we'll vote and we'll see what view took the question, right? But it's not just about our government or about our civic life in that way. I think it's also core to our faith, our sense that God is not done with me yet. And out of that sense, which can lead us to humility, we also hopefully can come to our neighbor with the sense, well, God's not done with them yet either, right? And both of those things are true. In the end, I need to be transformed by God's love. So do you. So do our neighbors. So do their neighbors. So does the whole world. I worry that the line drawing, shaming, shunning behavior, those practices foreclose on the possibility of transformation. In many ways, those practices are born out of the idea that we can't change people, people won't change, so we can cut them out. I'm curious, take a moment here, how many of you have changed your mind about something significant in your life? What was it that prompted your change of mind or heart? Take a second and think about that. Have you changed your mind about something significant in your life? What was it that prompted your change of mind or heart? Why don't we stay? I don't want to take too much time, but I'd love it if you just lean over to the person sitting next to you and share something you changed your mind about and why. Maybe I'll ask a couple people to share. Just take a minute to share with one another. Take one more minute. Start to wrap up here. Come back together. If you want to say the thing you changed your mind about, you can. But I'm curious more what it was that changed your mind. Yeah.
Growing up, and I was Roman Catholic, my parents were anti-abortionists to a big degree. We had pamphlets all around the house, and I believed, and I still believe, that abortion is a terrible thing. When I got to be 38, I was bearing twins, and one of them was going to die. It was not going to live. It hadn't formed properly. If I left that baby there, the other twin was going to die because it was going to be crushed. And so I had to have an abortion. And I did. But the couple days I had to make my choice were torture.
Wow.
They were tortures. I thought, God, why did you put it? What are you doing to me? Why do I have to make this choice? Every once, I still breathe that son I didn't get, but I got my daughter.
Wow.
And so now, when I hear the conversation around abortion, I still think it's a tremendous sort of tragic thing you have to do, because I felt that it was tragic.
Yeah.
But I don't try to judge what's going on in other people's lives. Like, I was listening to people talk on the subject, and I thought, you know, the way they're talking to these women who've had this happen or are thinking of having this happen is cruel. It's as cruel as it can be, because I lived through that whole thing. And yeah, it's changed my mind about a lot of subjects, because God comes into my life in one way, comes into your life in another way, and who am I to judge sort of right and wrong for other people?
Thank you for sharing it so warmly. Thank you. Yeah. So when we were in Guatemala in the late part of the 90s, I'd always been taught that all Guatemalan men are extremely patriarchal, and the families are that way. And it's very much the structure of the man's in charge and blah, blah, blah. And women shouldn't do anything. We're serving in this one village, and we come to support the church, and the church is led by a woman. And it blew my mind. And I asked them, and I said, you know, this doesn't follow the page thing. And they said, oh no, this is a very passionate Christian woman. She's got a great message. We're here to legitimize her. We ran her clinics out of her church. We legitimized her. Everybody saw her then in that village in a new light. And it was like, my head blew up because I never thought there was a liberal thing coming on. And then I began to see liberal things coming on. Not that they were liberal people, but in this case, it was just like, never have I seen a female minister lifted up in Guatemala.
Well,
Jeffrey was in a Pentecostal church. The
Uh,
hierarchy there is very flat.
It's difficult to tell because it's totally non-denominational. She was called by Jesus to lead. And it was a small colonial that's cut off from everything else, doesn't get any services and anything else. It's attached to a much larger city. So yes and no, because they're all Pentecostal to a degree. I mean, because I know what you're talking about. But the actual being in leadership was not a thing then. Now it's more prevalent. Now it's more prevalent.
yeah. One more? Anyone else? Sure.
Mine was very awakening. I've been a volunteer for Homefront for over 20 years, and when I first started to get to know the organization, I came from well, why do we keep having kids? And it was someone who introduced the idea that, they were foster children too. They've never had role models and examples of parenting, and it goes way deeper than that. But the person said to me, desperate people do desperate things. And all of a sudden, bells went off of the judgment, the delay of defeat, and the compassion of I will never know that story, but to live through compassion of desperate people do desperate things.
Well, thank you.
I've certainly changed my mind so much over the course of my life. And in almost every case, I think it was because someone who thought differently about something than I did loved me. And through my relationship with them, I came to see the world differently. They didn't love me because I was wrong, and they didn't love me because they were like, I want to change his mind about this thing. They just loved me. I think about these two guys, Marty at the top, Gilbert at the bottom. These are two of my dearest friends. I met them both when I was 18 years old. We're still friends today. They grew up in such different worlds than I had. I grew up in a kind of conservative evangelical world in Kansas and Southern California. My friend Marty grew up in a kind of Catholic, blue dog Democrat world in upstate New York. And my friend Gilbert grew up in the Bronx, in a Puerto Rican family in the Bronx. And I had never met people from their backgrounds. I'd certainly never been friends with folks like them. Got to college, and we had so many late night arguments, often with pizza. Not a good practice for me these days, but it was fun at that moment. And I think, our relationships were rooted in deep respect and love. But along the way, my whole view of the world changed through my relationship with them. And they're just two examples for me of the ways that relationships rooted in love can change us, even in ways we don't think we're going to be changed necessarily. But you wake up a few years later and you realize, I've actually come to think about this a little differently. I'll just tell one other quick story. This past summer, I was doing some work for PTS in California, and along the way, I thought I would really like to see this old friend of mine who had been an important person to me in my life growing up. I had tutored her daughter who had autism, and I'd become friends with their whole family. In the last decade, I hadn't really seen her. She's older than I am. We live many, thousands of miles apart. But on social media, we've been connected, and I've watched her fall down what to me seems like a really troubling political rabbit hole. And, there was a time a few years ago where I was trying to engage some of her posts on social media, and it wasn't going very well. And so I was just like, when am I going to do this anymore? This is not helpful. But I decided I was going to be passing through her neck of the woods, so I was like, I'm going to reach out to her. And she didn't write me back at first. I was like, well, maybe actually she's far enough down the rabbit hole that she's not going to talk to me anymore, which would have been really quite sad to me. But I followed up, and she said, oh yeah, I'd love to get together. So we got together. And it had been a long time since my kids, I have 4 boys, 3 of them were already in our family and were little at the point when I last saw her, I think in 2012 or 13. And since I had last seen her, we had brought a new child into our family through the foster care system here in New Jersey. And we were just catching up on things that had been happening in our lives that afternoon last summer. And I felt myself pausing about what I was going to share with her about our son who had come to live with us. Partly because I wasn't sure what she would say about him and about his family. And because there has been elements to that journey that have been hard for me to understand at times in terms of thinking about his family and why he's not with them right now. But I was like, I'm just going to tell her the story. We're catching up. And so I did. I told her about how he had come to live with us and what it had been like. And I was stunned because this person who, like an hour after I left her would post more memes that I find objectionable, in that moment, that brief moment that we were together, said something. She immediately understood the plight of my son's mother in a way that shocked me. It stopped me in my tracks. The level of moral insight that she had into his family that honestly I have struggled to have. An hour later, she's posting stuff on Facebook that I'm like, oh my gosh, I just can't. But I share that story. It's a different than I didn't change her mind. She didn't change my mind in that moment. I'm fundamentally not arguing that we should have these conversations purely in order to change someone's mind. But part of what that reminded me of is I actually learned from her in that moment. She is someone who over the course of that 10 years of only seeing her online, I had come to believe I have nothing to learn from her. But actually I do. So I sometimes when we talk about this stuff, you say, this is a different moment. Folks have dug in. There's no point in trying to remain in relationship with folks when we're so different. And I think for me, I've said this a few times over the course of the last few weeks, but I'll say it again, that I don't think everybody needs to be involved deeply, personally, in the work of bridge building. I don't know that all of us have that call or gift. And I think that's okay. But I do think in the world of a congregation like this one, if you can't personally do that work, maybe you can cheer on others who can. Because I do think that work does, as we've seen over the last few weeks, it does relate to these core things that Jesus calls us to in our faith. Even when folks think or believe really differently from us, even when they believe differently from us about things that are really important, they're still our neighbors. And I do wonder, I do believe, I think from everything I've read about how people do change in a society as deeply polarized as ours, it is through personal relationship. So I don't think we forge personal relationships in order to change people, but I think, there we go. I read this book a couple years ago, which I enjoyed. It may or may not appeal to you depending on your own politics. This fellow is a left-of-center guy who felt like people in his left-of-center circles had given up on the possibility of persuasion. And so he went around and interviewed a bunch of folks involved in contemporary social movements. And what he found, which is really interesting, and he kind of lets them make the case, is that folks building contemporary social movements like the civil rights movement of the 1960s basically say, hey, we got to stand up for what we believe in, but don't be a jerk. Because if you want what you believe in to be more likely to become a reality, don't be a jerk. Be generous. Be curious. Engage with people who don't already agree with you about the world you hope to see. One point in the book, and in some of the interviews he did about the book, he talked about how oftentimes, even those who you think, he makes the case in the book, again, kind of across political lines. Sometimes if you ask people, what percentage of folks in our society do you imagine are open to persuasion at this juncture in our nation's history, people will give you a really small percentage. And he says, actually, it's a much larger percentage than you might think. Because even folks who seem, on the face of it, to be totally dug in a view often have what he calls a side B. So someone has a really strong position on, say, immigration, but they know a person who had this experience that if you kind of tap into that, whatever the view on immigration might be over here, you can have a real conversation with that person. There's an interesting, he talks about this practice that has gotten some attention in the news of deep canvassing. You may know a lot of times political canvassing these days is a turn out the vote effort. You're not trying to talk to people that don't already agree with you. You're trying to knock on the doors of people that do agree with you and get them to go vote. There's folks in recent years in these deeply polarized times who have said, actually, we need to do this other kind of canvassing, what they call deep canvassing, where organizations, again, this is something that is interesting, no matter what your politics are, where they'll spend up to 30 minutes at a door, and they'll talk to anybody. And the idea, what folks who do this deeper canvassing work are trained to do, is not like, oh, this is what I do, this is what I believe, go out and vote, because you may be knocking on the door of someone who you know is not going to support your thing. But the strategy is get into a conversation with them about the things that matter to them, that are related to the thing you care about. Connect with them at a more human level. We talked last week about how sometimes when it sometimes helps when you're trying to forge a relationship if you don't start on the terrain that's the source of the deepest disagreement between you and the other person. And that's what this deep canvassing stuff is all about, is what if you forge a human connection with someone? This is stuff that relates to our civic and political life, but there are analogies for our faith as well. I think if deep canvassers can go door to door talking about the toughest issues facing our country, can't we find ways to stay in conversation with folks who don't think the same way we do about God or about the church? Can we find ways to hold love and truth together in a conversation with another that's rooted certainly in the convictions that we hold, but also in a commitment to generosity and curiosity? It requires good faith on our parts, and probably on theirs too. And I think that's the table stakes of these kinds of relationships that run through both love and truth, is can you come into that relationship with a commitment to the other person that's a little open-ended and that isn't going to say, I'm done changing, but I hope to change you. That's probably not going to work out very well, right? What if we were people who were open to the idea that God isn't done with us yet, and we enter into relationships even with people like that, my friend Beverly, who I mentioned a moment ago, who I came into that conversation really not thinking that I was going to learn anything from her in it, but, of a sense of duty. But I did learn from her, and I'm grateful that she was willing to sit down with me and to share openly with me, even as we disagree about so much. God's love is moving outward. I think that's one of the things that I would say always, all the time. God's love is moving outward. One of the dangers for us these days, this is this vision, right, of the end. God's love moving outward. There's a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne. That beautiful vision of God's love moving outward is a challenge to us, I think, to not be an inwardly focused people, content to talk only to the folks who are already in our holy huddle. It is possible, I think, to have relationships rooted in love that don't involve laying aside the things we hold most dear. But it takes a kind of, in these days especially, deep commitment to generosity, to curiosity, that springs probably first from this idea that God isn't done with me yet. If I don't believe that, then it's going to be harder to muster that generosity and curiosity. But if I believe God isn't done with me yet, we may find that we can still be transformed, and that others in our life, even those who seem the least likely to be transformed through love, may yet be. May yet be. I think that's something we should at least hope for and lean into in these times when that hope seems to be faltering all around us. What if we were known as people with that hope? That God might not be done with us yet, and sure, our neighbors too. All right, a few minutes for questions. What do you want to talk about? What are you thinking about? Yeah.
I haven't been here for the last 2 weeks, so I hope maybe it came up. When you talked about people being sort of careful about talking to the other side, I think we're all always afraid of breaking something, and nobody likes change, nobody wants to get old, nobody wants to have change. But I'm remembering that Christ said, I haven't come to make peace, I'm going to break you up. You're going to be broken from your parents and all this kind of thing, and that's such a terrible thought. But, I think we're breaking. We're just breaking, and that's what makes everybody sort of unhappy and unsettled. Sometimes you got to let, things happen.
Yeah.
And just trust them.
Yeah. I think that could be right. That sometimes you do find that in any particular relationship you're gonna have a time of distance or a time of coming apart in that relationship. That can be healthy. Sometimes we talked last week about the ways in which, like, at a structural level, like the media ecosystem is doing it, it's breaking us in those ways. And I'm not as convinced that those are healthy for us. But I think you're right, and I think it's good to sit with that. Yeah. We shouldn't be afraid of conflict. I mean, I hope that's one of the messages for me of this talk today. Is like, I don't think we should try to hide the stuff that we care about, put it aside in order to love our neighbors. I think you bring your whole self into, and sometimes that's going to mean there's conflict, but can there also be a well of generosity toward another person that springs from the idea that, like, I don't know everything.
Yeah, that's hugely important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how any exchange, however difficult our issues of the day, for example, might be, there's something we learn through those exchanges, even with people very far from where we are on these issues. And I think it's a kind of virtue that you might call humility in a Christian sense. That because I am, say, a person of faith, that doesn't mean I have all the answers. I have some that I think are precious, and I want to hold on to those, but that doesn't force me to make extravagant claims about having the whole of the truth. So there is something to learn.
Thank you.
And even if you just pick up on each other's vibe, that would be a positive thing beyond the verbal, that they can get to feel my vibe and understand I'm like them.
Right. No, that's great.
So you touched on here and there that there's sometimes there are times when the thing is so outside of anything you can accept that you just need to accept that. And so that's, in my personal example of that was in 2018 when
taking children away from parents at the book,
Sure.
was, I don't understand it, I can't even put my head around it, right? So my conclusion then was at that point, I don't know how to love you.
Yeah.
I know God loves you. I can't get there. I can't even approach trying to understand what motivates you to think that's okay.
Yeah.
That continues to happen in different areas so that you end up, I mean, I guess my struggle is getting to the point of just saying, I can't love you right now.
Yeah.
You're God's child too.
Yeah.
You know, it's a kind of a, okay, God, you've got this one.
Yeah.
I can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the only way that I can work my way through that without just being totally stumped.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's good to listen to those impulses in ourselves about when we feel
He can't be the person that does that work. Because I don't think we're all individually called to do that work all the time with every person. You know, I don't think that's right. I do think, for me, I make distinctions between people who are wielding power and people who are also just maybe putting people into power but don't have the power themselves. And to me, those are distinctions that can be helpful in thinking about this stuff. And so maybe you relate differently to the people that are wielding the power versus people that are our neighbors who may be involved in that. And that's one thing for me. I do think, I mean, again, everything that I've read about this stuff indicates, you know, if people are going to come to a different way of seeing the world, it is probably going to be through a person who does feel called to that work. You know, and it doesn't mean that you're the person, right? I mean, sometimes like a way to be a healthy person in the world is to say, I'm not responsible for all the things. There's so many things we could feel responsible for, right? And we don't all have to feel responsible. What I worry about is if none of us take any responsibility for that work, some of us may be better poised to do that work than others. So especially if you're a person who could be well poised to do that hard work, you know, prayerfully consider. You know, and I think that's a discernment that we can all do in community, you know. And again, we don't all, this congregation can take up certain kinds of witness that may mean that like the burden of this doesn't fall so heavily on any particular person. There will come a day when people will look back on me as well and say, well, gosh, on this issue, he didn't even know how wrong he was. And they'll probably be right. You know what I mean? So I think that's the other thing that I keep in mind, right? I can look at some people right now, I could think of lots of categories of people like, you know, along the lines of what you're describing, and be like, I cannot believe that they would allow themselves to be complicit in that. I'm not sure what I may be complicit in. I don't want to also draw like equivalences entirely either, but I also, I want to call myself up short a little bit on this, because I think just as a historian, you know, you look back at the people that I admire sometimes in the early 20th century, these social gospel people that I'm writing a book about, who were deeply complicit in horrible things that they didn't even recognize because they thought they were doing the right thing. So I do think that's part of our human condition as well, you know, and God only knows. I don't know. So I hear you, and I affirm what you're saying, and I also wonder about how do we, I don't know. Yeah, how do we hold those things together? I'm over time. I think I got to end, right? Thank you all. We'll come back together one more time next week. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heath. All right, yeah, it's 10:48. So those of you who are heading to 11 o'clock worship and don't wish to help reset this room, I'll courteously invite you to move quickly to the sanctuary. And then if a few people could stick around and help me get this room reset for our potluck, that'd be really helpful. We want 7 round tables in here. And they're currently right over here in the Potter room in the little rack. And then we'll use these chairs as well as the chairs in the back there to put around them. And then we need 3 rectangular tables here at the front, okay? This is God's work, people. All right. So whoever's willing to help, let's do it.